right, so are you ready to dive into some seriously fascinating research about crowd evacuation?
Yeah, this is a topic that hits close to home for, well, pretty much everyone, right?
Exactly, like we've all been there, packed stadiums, concerts, even just a busy shopping mall, and then suddenly an emergency, everyone needs to get out fast.
And that's when things can get a little dicey.
To say the least, so one of our listeners sent in this 2025 article from the Journal of Reliable Intelligent Environments.
Sketchy title, huh?
Oh yeah, Optimizing Crowd Evacuation.
Hmm.
Evaluation of strategies for safety and efficiency.
Snappy.
So let's paint the picture for everyone. A stadium full of people, something happens, and boom, it's evacuate time. What's the first thing that pops into your head?
Well, you'd think just knowing where the exits are would be enough, right?
Right, like that's basic fire drill 101.
Exactly. But the study digs into this. It's called the full knowledge strategy. Everyone knows where to go. Seems logical,
Well,
right?
it seems like a foolproof plan.
Well, not so fast.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out even when everyone theoretically knows the best way out, things can still go wrong.
Well,
Oh, yeah. Think about it. You're in a panicked crowd. Visibility might be low smoke darkness, maybe? And suddenly that clear mental map of the exits isn't so clear anymore.
okay. Yeah, I can see how that would throw things off.
And that's where things get a bit hairy. People start bunching up, maybe heading for the same exit, even though there might be a clearer path somewhere else.
A classic bottleneck situation.
Exactly. And the study found that even with full knowledge, you still get those clusters forming slower evacuation times and sadly more simulated casualties.
So knowledge is power, but only if you can actually use it.
Right. It highlights that human behavior, especially under stress, doesn't always follow logic.
Which is kind of unsettling to think about. So what's the takeaway here? Just knowing the exits isn't enough.
It's a good starting point for sure. But this study really underscores the importance of being mentally prepared. Don't just assume you'll remember where to go in a real emergency.
So like next time I'm at a concert or a game, I should actually take a minute to scope out the exits.
Exactly.
Right.
Maybe even visualize different escape routes. Sounds a bit morbid.
I know. But hey, better safe than sorry, right?
Absolutely. That kind of mental prep could make all the difference in a real situation.
Okay. I'm already feeling a little more prepared just thinking about it.
Good, because next up, we're tackling a strategy that's, well, let's just say it's a bit less effective.
Oh. This sounds ominous.
It's called follow the crowd, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. People just follow whoever's around them, no real plan, just reacting to the movement of the mass.
So basically the lemming effect.
You got it.
Yeah.
And as you can probably guess, this one didn't fare too well in the simulations.
I'm guessing lots of virtual casualties?
Well, yeah, the highest by far. Mostly due to crushing and getting trapped by the simulated fire.
Which makes sense. If no one's making informed decisions and everyone's just reacting to the panic around them, it's just amplifying the chaos.
Exactly. And this is where the study gets really interesting because it starts to touch on those real-life emergency drills we all know and love.
You mean the fire alarm goes off,
Yeah.
everyone shuffles out, half the people are chatting on their phones, no one's really taking it seriously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Study authors actually point out that in real-life drills, there's often a lack of genuine danger.
Yeah, because it's not a real fire.
Right. People aren't experiencing the same fear and urgency they would in a real emergency. So these drills, while important, might not be fully capturing how people would actually behave when the stakes are high.
So it's like we're practicing a watered-down version of the real thing.
In a way, yeah, and that
Huh.
could be giving us a false sense of security.
Okay, so follow the crowd is a no-go. What's the alternative?
This is where things get a bit more hopeful. The third strategy they modeled is called follow the leader.
Follow the leader. Now that sounds more promising.
And it consistently showed the best results in the simulations.
Faster evacuation.
Fewer casualties, a much more organized exit flow.
I like the sound of that. So how did this follow the leader thing actually work?
They designated certain agents in the simulation as leaders. These leaders were programmed with knowledge of all the exits, and importantly, which ones were less crowded.
So they weren't just heading for the nearest exit. They were actually making strategic decisions.
Exactly. And then the other agents were programmed to basically follow the nearest leader.
Okay, so it's not just blindly following anyone. It's about identifying someone who seems to know what they're doing.
Precisely. And that's where the real-world application gets interesting.
But how realistic is this in a real emergency? It's not like everyone's going to have a flashing neon sign above their head saying, "Leader, follow me."
Right. That's where things get tricky.
Hmm.
But this strategy really highlights the importance of information and clear direction in these chaotic situations.
So even if it's not a designated leader per se, being able to identify someone who's calm, seems to know what they're doing, and following their lead could increase your chances of getting out safely.
Absolutely. It's about being observant, using your judgment, and not just getting swept up in the panic.
Okay, that's actually a really empowering thought. It's not just about being a passive part of the crowd, it's about being proactive.
Exactly. And we'll dive into the real-world applications of this concept in more detail later.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. So we've got full knowledge, good but flawed, follow the crowd, a recipe for disaster, and follow the leader, the potential hero of the hour. But what else did this research uncover? We're just scratching the surface here, right?
Oh, yeah. There's a
Yeah.
lot more to unpack. Buckle up, because in part two, we're going to delve even deeper into some of the more surprising and, frankly, unsettling findings from this study.
Okay, I'm ready for more. Bring on the unsettling findings.
One thing that really jumped out at me in this study was how they actually factored in panic.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. In a real emergency, it's not like people are calmly strolling toward the nearest exit, right?
Not quite. There's fear, adrenaline, all sorts of things messing with our rational thinking.
So how did they even begin to model that in the simulation?
Well, they actually built in this 3-level panic scale for their little digital agents.
A panic scale.
Yep. Level 1 was basically business as usual, folks moving at a normal pace.
Hmm.
But when the simulated fire got within an agent's line of sight, boom, level 2 kicked in. Movement speed increased significantly, mirroring that initial jolt of like, oh crap, gotta get out of here.
So just seeing the threat ramped things up a notch? Makes sense.
But it doesn't stop there.
I figured as much. What about when things get really, really scary?
That's level 3. When the fire got really close to an agent, like less than half their field of vision, they basically went into a full-on sprint panic mode engaged.
Yeah, that's fight or flight kicking in, right?
Exactly. Pure survival instinct. But all that panic sprinting probably didn't do wonders for the overall evacuation flow.
I was just thinking that. More collisions, more bottlenecks, more chaos.
You got it.
Huh.
As those panic levels increased in the simulation, you saw a predictable spike in all those things. Collisions, bottlenecks, virtual casualties, the whole 9 yards.
So it's like a vicious cycle. The more panicked people get, the more chaotic the situation becomes, making it even harder to get out safely.
It's a sobering thought, for sure.
Mm.
But this is where I think awareness can play a huge role.
Oh.
Yeah, like just knowing that panic can actually make things worse might help some people keep a cooler head.
So you're saying that just being aware of this panic factor could actually help someone stay calmer in a real emergency?
It's possible. If you're aware that freaking out is going to make the situation more dangerous, maybe you're more likely to take that deep breath, try to assess the situation, and not just blindly follow the panicked herd.
Okay, I like that. It's not just about accepting that panic is inevitable. It's about understanding it and maybe even using that knowledge to keep a lid on it.
Exactly.
So we've got knowledge of exits, we've got the follow the leader concept, and now we're adding a layer of self-awareness about how panic can mess things up. What else did this study uncover?
Well, there's one more piece I think is worth highlighting. Remember how we were talking about how the leaders in that strategy were programmed to know which exits were less crowded?
Yeah, they were making smart decisions, not just heading for the most obvious exit.
Right. Well, the researchers actually developed this formula to calculate the workload of each exit in the simulation.
Workload, so like how jammed up each exit was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They factored in things like the number of people using an exit, their speed, all
Yeah,
those
so they were able to actually quantify how congested each exit was at any given time. That's pretty cool.
It is. And they used that workload data to inform the decisions of those virtual leaders.
Yeah.
The leaders were basically programmed to assess the situation in real time and steer their followers toward the exits with the lowest workload.
So they were dynamically adjusting their guidance based on the changing conditions in the simulation. That's like having a crowd traffic controller.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why follow the leader was so effective in the model. By distributing the crowd more evenly across all available exits, they were able to prevent those massive, dangerous bottlenecks from forming.
It's making me think about how technology could play a role in real-world evacuations. Like, imagine if we had real-time info on exit congestion in a stadium or a theater.
Oh, absolutely.
You could have digital signs updating people, directing them to the less crowded exits, maybe even apps on our phones that could guide us to safety.
It's not science fiction. It's totally doable with the tech we have today.
Right. We've got navigation apps that reroute us around traffic jams. Why not apply that same thinking to crowd flow in emergencies?
Exactly.
This research feels like it's laying the groundwork for some seriously innovative solutions. It's not just about understanding the problem, it's about using that understanding to design better systems and ultimately keep people safer.
I completely agree. And, for our listener who sent in this research, it might spark some ideas.
Yeah, like what?
Think about the places you frequent. Do they have clear exit signage?
Mm-hmm.
Do they seem to have a plan in place for managing crowd flow in an emergency? Maybe this research can even empower you to ask those questions, to advocate for better safety measures in your community.
I like that. It's about taking this knowledge and actually putting it into action.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got a lot to think about here. We've gone from panic levels to high-tech crowd management to the importance of good spatial design. This is a lot to digest even for a deep
It
dive.
is a lot.
I'm guessing our listeners probably wondering, okay, so what does all this theoretical stuff have to do with my actual life?
That's a great question. And that's the perfect segue to the final part of our deep dive. Because in part 3, we're going to step out of the simulation and into the real world. We'll look at some historical examples of crowd disasters and see how the insights from this research might have helped prevent or at least mitigate those tragedies.
Okay, now we're getting to the real heart of the matter. Stay with us because this is where things get real and frankly a bit heartbreaking. But remember, the goal here isn't to dwell on the negative, it's to learn from these events and hopefully create a safer future.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into crowd evacuation. And things are about to get real, right?
Yeah, we've talked about the theory, the simulations, but now we're going to look at some actual historical events, some real-world tragedies.
And I think it's important to acknowledge upfront that these events are incredibly complex, and there's rarely a single cause for these kinds of disasters.
Right. It's usually a combination of factors that lead to these tragic outcomes. But by looking at them through the lens of the research we've been discussing, we can start to see some patterns emerge, some common threads that might help us prevent these things from happening again.
Exactly.
Mm.
So one of the most well-known and sadly one of the deadliest crowd disasters is the Hillsborough disaster back in 1989.
A football match in England where 97 people lost their lives.
Yeah, a horrific event, and it really highlights how quickly things can go wrong when you have a massive crowd, limited exits, and a breakdown in effective crowd management.
It seems like a textbook case of what we were talking about earlier, those bottlenecks, the crush of people all trying to get out at the same time.
Exactly. And investigations after the event found that there were a number of contributing factors.
Yeah.
Communication failures, poor signage, directing people to exits, and a lack of control over the flow of people into the stadium.
So it's not just about individuals panicking, it's about the system failing to accommodate the crowd safely.
Right, and sadly, Hillsborough is not an isolated incident. There are other examples, like the Love Parade disaster in Germany in 22.
Then where 21 people died.
Yeah, a bottleneck formed in a narrow tunnel leading to the festival grounds, and the crowd pressure just became too much.
It's almost unimaginable being caught in a situation like that.
Yeah.
But it really underscores the importance of understanding crowd dynamics and having effective strategies in place to manage these situations.
Absolutely, and this is where the research we've been discussing comes in, the follow the leader concept.
Right. Imagine if in these real-world events there had been trained personnel strategically positioned throughout the crowd.
People who could have directed others to less congested exits, calmed things down, prevented those crushes from happening in the first place.
It's a powerful thought, and it makes you wonder, could we apply these insights not just to massive events, but to our everyday lives?
Well, I think that's the key takeaway here. It's about shifting our mindset from being passive members of a crowd to being more aware, more observant.
So, like, next time I'm at a concert or a sporting event, I should be thinking about where the exits are, how I would get out if there was an emergency.
Exactly. And maybe even taking on a leadership role yourself if the situation calls for it.
Helping others to stay calm, making sure everyone's moving in the right direction.
Absolutely. Because sometimes just being that calm presence in a chaotic situation can make all the difference.
It's about empowering ourselves with knowledge and understanding that we all have a role to play in keeping ourselves and each other safe.
Right. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving. And that means creating a world where these kind of tragedies are less likely to occur.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. Knowledge is power, but it's only powerful if we use it. So let's all commit to being more aware, more prepared, and more proactive when it comes to crowd safety. Because together, we can make a difference.
Well said. And as always, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe.